Hello, everyone. This is the Distracted Spectrum. It used to be Jono's World, but that was way too much of a. I'm a late 80s, 90s kid, and very cliche. So, Distracted Spectrum, playing off the idea of I have ADHD and autism, and I am going to talk about a variety of things from sports to the Bible to history and Viking archaeology like we have in the past. But today we have Dan McLean. Probably said it right. McClellan.
McClellan.
McClellan. Being a redhead, I'm embarrassed that I keep messing it up. But he is my favorite Bible guy. I kind of wanted to take a picture of Bible Man and just post your face on it and have that be the graphic for this show. But go ahead and introduce yourself, and I want you to take a moment. If you're rocking a fit, I'm Hey Arnold today. Move it football head.
Yep.
Yeah, I kind of related to Hey Arnold because he was a football head and I was a redhead, so there was always the head jokes.
Yeah.
So, and I had a unusually disproportionate head when I was a kid. It was so big that it toppled me over, and I had to get multiple stitches.
Oh.
But yeah. So, go ahead and introduce yourself and brag about your recent award.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time and the opportunity to join you on your show. My name is Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. I have a PhD from the University of Exeter. I also have a couple of master's degrees, one from Oxford University, another from a university in Canada called Trinity Western University. And then I got my bachelor's long ago at Brigham Young University. I was a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church for just over a decade. And then decided to pivot to doing content creation full-time. So for a little over a year now, I have been doing content creation full-time. I have a podcast of my own. I'm working on a trade book, so I'm just doing all kinds of other stuff so that I never have to wear a tie again. And it's been wonderful. And speaking of the shirt, I decided to bust out my own...
Nice.
So you got the 90s Nickelodeon, including some Hey Arnold, the Rugrats,
yeah, Chucky,
Rocko's Modern Life. So some of the things that I watched when I was in high school back in the 90s.
Nice. I loved Rocko's. Man, Rocko's was awesome.
Yeah, I enjoyed Rocko's Modern Life quite a bit as well. And yeah, last year I was given the Richards Award for Public Scholarship by the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the largest professional organization for Bible scholarship in the world. So I was pretty flattered and humbled by that, and pretty excited as well. And I'm going to continue to do what I can to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also combat the spread of misinformation about it, which is one of the main things that I do on social media.
And that's why, I remember, I'm going through my process of going, some of these things just don't add up, like how they're recorded. And one day, one of your TikToks come across, and I went, wait, that makes sense. That makes way more sense. And so, and so I began to track with you and, look up your sources and things like that. And I was like, oh, this guy's actually he knows what he's, and so I just started following along. And, the podcast, one of the things that, interested me the most, that caught my, how do we trust this thing? How do we know how all of this came together, and how many times it was changed? Was when, after being a pastor for 17 years, I'd never even heard of the idea that God had a wife. Ashra, what are you talking about? And so And so that was a moment for me where I was like, all right, like what is this book? I have the interlinear Bibles, I have multiple translations, all of these traditional Christian study tools, that
Hmm.
universities that I attend and churches that I attend use, and typically they pump out a specific, point of view. Wayne Room systematic theology to David Possum's unlocking the Bible. They all have a narrative, and so whenever you begin to look from a historical perspective, you start seeing a totally different kind of picture.
Yeah.
And so my biggest question is like, how did this happen? Like, how did it all come together? How did this dude named Moses get credit for everything? How did Paul get credit for 13 books when, he was dead when most of them were written? Um, so like, what the heck? How can anyone trust this word of God? You
Yeah.
know?
And so the conceptualization of the Bible as the Word of God is itself a post-biblical innovation. There's
Okay.
no part of the Bible that, well, one, there's no part of the Bible that refers to the Bible because it hadn't
Right.
been compiled yet. It was not a single volume. There were around the time of Jesus' life, there were the scriptures, but this was kind of an unbound category. It was just a large collection of scrolls. And you can't
Do we know
you
what
can't
those would have been? Would it have been
uh,
the Old Testament, or would it have been Old Testament plus the Apocrypha plus 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 plus?
yeah, it would have been the Old Testament. It would have been what we call pseudepigraphic writings. It would have been the Apocrypha. There were a wide variety of writings, but because they were on separate scrolls, like every book for the most part was on its own scroll. With a book, you can put everything together within a cover, and that's
Right.
a single unit. That's a corpus right there. But when you've just got a stack of scrolls, you can't really put a cover around a stack of scrolls. And so it's kind of naturally unbounded. And some people would have seen certain texts as scripture, other people would have seen those texts as not scripture. There was no systematic, authoritative delineation of what counted and what didn't. So it was kind of an amorphous, fluid category. So when someone referred to the scriptures, graphi in Greek, it could have meant any one of a number of different collections of texts. And one of the reasons we know some of the New Testament authors had a broader conceptualization of the scriptures than we do now is because they're quoting from or they're alluding to stories that are not in any canonical text. So the book of Hebrews, for instance, when it talks about these
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek is in there, and that's only mentioned in Genesis, but there were certainly other traditions about Melchizedek. The Dead Sea
Right.
Scrolls, for instance, have some traditions about Melchizedek. But in the examples of great faith from chapter 11, for instance, it talks about people who didn't accept deliverance because they were hoping for a better resurrection. And this is a reference to a story from the book of 2 Maccabees, which is part of the Apocrypha. The
Yeah.
Epistle of Jude refers, even quotes a passage from 1 Enoch.
The Apocrypha,
Which-
everyone. Grab you a
There's
copy.
yeah. There's a quotation from 1 Enoch and Jude, which is not even a part of the Apocrypha. It is another text, a phenomenally influential text, and you can see
Wild.
the effects of its influence in the Gospels. You can see it in the later epistles. You can see it all over the place. So they didn't really whittle it down to what we have now until probably the 2nd through the 4th, 5th centuries. And within Christianity, they did the same for what we now refer to as the New Testament. But it wasn't until around the 5th century that we have the notion of the Bible as a single volume of text. And so
Now, who did
when-
that? Just for the listeners, like, who did that? Like, who was the grandpapa that had the authority to go, this is the word, and this is what you get to read and nothing else?
Well, it kind of slowly crystallized over multiple centuries, and the main influence, at least for the Christian canon, was probably what books were considered appropriate to quote and preach from in your congregation, in the meetings when your community came together. And so the earliest canon lists that we have are basically reports of what books are being used in congregations and which are not. And then there are a few different tiers. It's not a binary, it's more of a spectrum where it's like, well, this is spurious, this is okay, this is considered authoritative. And the list differed close to the margins, but around the late 4th century CE, we have this dude named Athanasius of Alexandria, who's a leader of the church in Egypt, who is trying to clamp down on what he sees as heterodox practices and literature. And so he creates one of the first authoritative canon lists, where he actually says, these are all the books. And he's one of the first, in fact, I think he's the first to assert that the book of Revelation should be part of our canon. And he finishes by saying, this is the list, curse anybody who adds to it or takes from it, kind of in the same tradition as Deuteronomy and the book of Revelation. And that was what ended up kind of guiding the discussion after that. But you have some councils that kind of take a look at these lists and say, yeah, this works for us. But when this was going on, this was a version of the scriptures that was recorded in Greek. So even the Old Testament was recorded in Greek, and so included some of the apocryphal books. And they were part of that in between. They were deuterocanonical.
Right.
They were considered of a second tier, but still within the canon. And it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that folks like Luther start saying, "No, we got to leave this stuff to the side, not completely out, but at least to the side." And so instead of having the Apocrypha worked into the Old Testament, he gathered it all together and he put it in a different section. So you had the Old Testament, you had the Apocrypha, you had the New Testament. And Luther actually also wanted to get rid of things like the Epistle of James and the Epistle of the Hebrews. And other texts that he did not think were authoritative. And so he also moved them in like an appendix, and that didn't stick. But the moving of the Apocrypha into a separate section did stick. And right. Protestants continued to use the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was published in the King James Version in 1611, for instance. And you know, a lot of publishers
That's
had
the
editions.
one I have.
That's the one you have, the 1611? Mm-hmm. And you know, there were numerous editions and reprints and versions of the King James Version, and some of them included the Apocrypha, some of them didn't. And then in the 19th century, that was kind of when Protestants decided, you know what, we're just going to leave it out. And it was publishers like the British and Foreign Bible Society and the American Bible Society that probably made the decision initially because it made for a slimmer volume, it was easier to ship, it was easier to source, it was cheaper to print. And by the end of the 19th century, Protestants pretty much decided the Apocrypha is not for us anymore. So it's a series of decisions and then chasing down the implications of those decisions, making more decisions and chasing down the implications of those decisions, and so on. So a lot of people like to think about it as everybody thought one thing, and then there was a day where everybody decided they were just going to think another thing. And it's not how it worked at all. It was a bunch of people getting together, arguing about stuff, and just kind of slowly, incrementally, you get these ideas
negotiating down to what it is.
Exactly.
And that's all right. And so, in that, you know, I thought I had a second ago, a good reason that we use books and not scrolls is, for instance, the oldest scroll that we have of, I think, Isaiah is 26 foot long.
It's pretty long.
Yeah, it's something like that. So there's a, you know, I'm glad we use books now and not these, not these giant.
That was an innovation of early Christianity because everybody began by using scrolls. And then the idea of a codex was something that was beginning to pick up in Rome, because things could be kept on individual sheets that could all be bound together. And initially, the scrolls were considered appropriate for special stuff. You kept them on scrolls. And then the Christian writings were kept on codices. And when the Christian writings began to be seen as scriptural, Christians decided, you know what, we're going to move everything into the Codex. And so it was a uniquely Christian innovation, and that has kind of changed the world of literature ever since. But it certainly makes things a lot a lot more convenient to carry around.
It does. But when you're growing up in most churches, the way that the Bible, in American evangelical Christianity, the way it's presented to you is that, these men, just these men that wrote these books, had these divinely inspired moments. And it was just these men, only these men, no more, and that's it. And anything outside of that is heresy. And that is very much the way that it's presented. But historically, it doesn't seem like there's any context for that.
Yeah, and when we look at the way the Bible came together, and I made a video about this recently, when you look at Genesis 1, and then you look at Genesis 2 and 3.
I was going to bring that up.
These are two different creation stories.
Yes.
And the one in Genesis 2 and 3 is probably earlier. It presents a more anthropomorphic, corporeal God that creates by manipulating the soil. And it talks about the day on which God made the earth and the heavens. And then you get Genesis 1, which is a later creation account. This is the priestly account. And this is a more transcendent deity. It doesn't talk about the God walking through the garden and making noise. It's just this God who creates by divine fiat. They speak and things come into existence. And a big difference is in the story of Adam and Eve, God creates Adam, and then God sees that it's not good, that Adam is alone. And so has to try to, through a process of trial and error, create a suitable companion. And in Genesis 1, the big distinction there is God creates by divine fiat, and every time God creates, God sees that it was good. So this is not a God who makes mistakes. This is not a God who has to correct their work. This is a deity where everything is good right off the bat. But at one point, they got put together on a single scroll, and now people have to try to interpret them as a single narrative.
And uncredited to the same writer.
Right. And so when you have what the author of Genesis 1 was trying to communicate, you have what the author of Genesis 2 and 3 was trying to communicate, and then you have some editor who smacked them together right next to each other, and now the location of the authority is in that editor, whoever that was. We have no idea who they were. They didn't write anything. And so this notion that, it was just these, I forget how, 45 inspired writers, and they were inspired, and therefore what they wrote was authoritative. But in reality, the book came together thanks to a lot of redactors and editors and copyists and scribes. And there's so much in there that so much of the meaning that people negotiate with the text is the work of those unnamed editors and scribes and copyists, and not the people who actually wrote the text. And so it gets really, really messy when you look at the data.
Yeah.
The notion that we attribute or ascribe inspiration and inerrancy and univocality to this text just gets obliterated once you understand how the text actually came together. There's no way to hold all of those things together. That the author of Genesis 1 was inspired and inerrant, but the author of Genesis 2 and 3 was also inspired and inerrant, because the texts conflict. They disagree with each other. And so it's one of the reasons I constantly say that the data don't support univocality, inspiration, inerrancy. Those are dogmas. that somebody came up with this idea, hey, it should be like this. This is how we should understand it. Not because the data indicate it, but because this is useful for our group. And then other people had to just say, okay. And so it's a dogma is just something that people choose to accept. It's not something that's demonstrated. It's not something that is supported by any data.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then that makes, to me, that makes my brain go, yeah. Yeah,
it makes more sense.
It makes more sense. It makes just like evolution makes more sense than God creating an old Earth,
hiding dinosaur bones there, or the devil was hiding the stuff to throw us off.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things I enjoy about critical scholarship is it produces explanations that are just intuitive and make sense.
Yes.
And things fall into place.
Yes.
Because you say, oh, well, that makes better sense. And that makes better sense to this other thing over here. And suddenly this other thing over here. But when you try to approach it from the perspective of these dogmas, you constantly have to fend off why it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And you just have to keep asserting over and over again, no, it has to be this way. It has to be this way. It has to be this way. Not because the data indicate, but because it's useful for our group's structuring of power and values and boundaries. And it's just more fascinating, too. I think it's more interesting. We allow the author's rhetorical goals to bubble to the surface, and it's more interesting to me. Some people think it's problematic, but to me, it's just a lot more interesting.
It is to me too, and while we're diving in, where did the Torah come from? Like this guy Moses. And I want to throw a conspiracy at you first.
Okay,
a good one about Moses. I think the oldest reference we have to the land of Canaan was, found on a tablet in Egypt, 5,000 years old, and it's just basically Canaan is desolate. Isn't that correct?
Well, we have a reference to Israel from around the year 1208 BCE, the Merneptah Stele, that says Israel is desolate, his seed is not, or something like that.
Yeah, it's something along those lines. But what if Moses, meaning son of, kind of the beginning of a pharaoh name. Mm-hmm. What if given the story of Adam and Eve, technically Adam and Eve are brother and sisters, whose kids are going to marry each other, mm-hmm. which is what Pharaoh's done. So what if Moses was a dude who looked around, he saw King Tut, and I just figured he was, and then he saw the regular people, and he went, hey, y'all, let's go this way.
I think there is a lot of incest historically within royal families and dynasties, which has caused problems that result in disability and birth defects and much shorter lives and things like that. But it was, I think it was something that was more kind of imposed on. It was an ideology that was imposed upon the elites. I think most common folks understood that was a no-no, that it caused issues. But that is an interesting conspiracy theory. You certainly have with the legislative stuff in the Torah, you have a lot of prohibitions on incest and things like that. So it's not totally precluded by the data, but I would say there's no data that points in that direction. Yeah, the data don't support the historicity of a figure named Moses, at least certainly not the way Moses is represented in the story of the Exodus.
And he definitely didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible.
No, absolutely not. There are scholars out there that posit that perhaps the story of the Exodus is kind of a faded memory of a very small group of enslaved people who escape from enslavement and make their way either into the northern hill country from the land of Egypt, or maybe they're already nearby, they're already in the land of Canaan, and they escape and set up camp somewhere and become part of Israel, and the story just grows over the generations and becomes this grand exodus out of Egypt. There are different theories for how that all happened. But
kind of like the rumor mill. You go around the room, and by the time you get to the end, the story is.
Yeah, and only this time it's 500-700 years of that going on.
Right.
It grows, but most scholars would point out that we don't have any evidence for what we would call narrative prose, so like narrative storytelling that is not poetry. We don't see that in alphabetic scripts. And Hebrew, Old Hebrew would be an alphabetic script.
Right.
We don't see that until around the year 850, 800 BCE. Prior to that, all the storytelling was poetic parallelism and stuff like that.
So that's like the beginning of the prophets, right?
So that the prophets come shortly after, but they're writing. They're not writing narrative prose. Prophecy is a genre all its own.
Totally.
But the point is that stories like Genesis and Exodus with all this narrative prose, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he said this, and then this happened. Stories like that can't predate around 850 BCE. And so if you have any stories like that, they were not written down until 850, 800 BCE at the very earliest. Now, they can be oral traditions that are being passed down, and then they're being written down, but they're not being written down until the late 9th century at the very earliest. And so these stories probably don't date any earlier than that. Now, we have poetry in there. The Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 is poetry, and it kind of tells the story a little bit. It's a different story, though. You have poetry like the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. A lot of scholars think these may come before the development of narrative prose. And so they could go back to 1000 BCE, maybe even as far back as like 1100 BCE. And so we don't even get the beginnings of the narrative that we find in the Torah until 850, 800 at the earliest. The final form as we have it today, or more or less in the shape we have it today, probably happened between the 3rd and the 2nd century BCE. So we're talking a period of maybe around 600 years for the Torah to come together. And so initially we have a bunch of narrative strands that are operating independently.
Yeah, and what are those? Like, because I've seen bits and pieces of that. Like, I've seen they took Numbers, got this information from this little piece of silver, and like I've seen these little clips and pieces, but it seems like that they borrow.
Yeah.
Here's your outline of our Israel's deity.
So it's coming from a bunch of different sources. Some of those earliest stories are probably the Exodus narrative. Scholars think that is probably a very early northern tradition. Also in the north, you probably have what we call the Jacob cycle. So the chapters in Genesis that are all about Jacob, those probably circulated independently of everything else. There was probably an Abraham cycle. There was an Isaac cycle. There were also these royal annals or royal histories that were being kept. And when you get down to like Josiah, then they begin to kind of edit them together into this macro narrative.
Isn't that where Asherah disappears?
Yes, with Josiah, this is where you probably have some editing of Asherah out of the text, and then you have the texts, the history from the earlier kings is being rewritten and represented as apostasy. So originally, Asherah and Adonai, probably consorts, husband and wife, and there were probably very few people who had a problem with that. Josiah is Sennacherib comes through a couple of generations before Josiah, destroys most of the northern kingdom, most of the big cities in Judah, is unable to destroy Jerusalem, and what this does is this destroys all the other temples and all the other main cultic sites. So the places where you went to worship, to make your offerings, where there were divine images and things like that. All that was left was the temple in Jerusalem. The kings after Hezekiah, there are two kings who come after Hezekiah, seem to be trying to restore the earlier worship. So instead of just having the Jerusalem temple and nothing else, we're going to try to return to the way things were before Sennacherib destroyed everything. Josiah rises to the throne and probably looked around and went, nah, I kind of like it this way, where everybody has to come to my temple, everybody has to use my priesthood, all the offerings come into my city, and so says, guess what I found last night in the temple? The book of the law. Turns out we've been doing everything wrong for generations, and so we're going to do things right from now on. And coincidentally, doing things right is doing everything that benefits me.
So was he the first Christian nationalist?
Certainly not the first nationalist, but I think Josiah is probably the threshold of this trajectory towards an ultra-nationalism, towards monotheism, which would not come until after the Bible, but we're moving in that direction. Certainly the idea that the Jerusalem temple is the only appropriate place to worship Adonai is part of this. And so these things are coming together and being edited by elites who are trying to structure power and values and boundaries. And so the D strand, the Deuteronomist strand, is the one that was probably begun by Josiah. And they're taking from the stories, they're taking from the poetry, they're taking from the history. And then you have P, which is the priestly source, which is probably people during the exile who are maybe they're descended from priests, or they are priests, but they're like, we need this, we need to preserve this stuff, we need to emphasize this stuff, we need holiness.
They at least knew the importance of it.
Yeah. And so they produce their own version of what Josiah is producing, and this is the priestly source. And then some scholars talk about J and E, the Yahwist source and the Elohist source, based on the preference for these different names for God. Other scholars would say we can't really distinguish them as independent sources. We just talk about D, P, and non-P. But these are three different main strands that are being brought together. And then in the Persian period into the Greco-Roman period, they're probably being combined into one. And then by around the 2nd century BCE, this is probably when knowledge of the Pentateuch, the Torah, begins to be widespread, begins to be enforced as well. And it's probably with the rise of the Hasmonean kingdom. So around the time of the Maccabees, the time of the persecution under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, you probably have these rulers coming to power, and they want to establish a single unified identity, this nationalism, and the way they're going to do this is by using these stories and this constructed lineage, this idea that we're all related, that all these scattered tribes actually descend from one person. And so we're all family. We're brothers. Why can't we all just get along? It's a way to try to unify everybody under the authority of this Hasmonean kingdom that is trying to establish itself.
Well, so evolutionarily speaking, that is true. We do all have
we're all brothers.
Yeah, we do all have one common ancestor.
Yeah, we do have a common ancestor pretty far back. We don't have records that go that far back.
No,
but they're trying to distinguish themselves from everybody around them as well. And I think this is a matter of preservation.
Right.
And we see this in the exile. We see it in the persecutions under the Seleucids and others. This desire to kind of circle the wagons around our group so that our group can survive. And I think the reason that the Bible has persevered for as long as it has is because it's been curated and preserved by an ethnic group, a people who has persevered for so long against the longest odds. The fact that the Jewish people have survived for as long as they have is nothing short of miraculous. And in light of all the things all the empires that have been thrown at them, and all of the persecution and the oppression, that it was a successful campaign. Like I think there are a handful of decisions made by leaders that I think have turned the world into what it is today, at least when we're talking about the way the Bible relates to the world. The idea to conflate Adonai and El, originally these were two distinct deities, and somewhere around 1000 BCE, some king got the idea to say, hey, these are the same God. I think that is the first decision that set the snowball rolling that would become what a lot of people now fallaciously call, the Judeo-Christian world. Josiah's decision to come up with this idea of cult centralization, I think, is another decision that was one of the most influential decisions that was ever made by a human ruler. I think those two decisions, as much as at least Josiah's annoys me, but those two decisions are probably some of the most influential decisions that any ruler has ever made.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that really made me, kind of take a step back and go, can I trust what's recorded? Like, how much of let's just go with the Old Testament, because the New Testament that's a whole nother hour. It's like, you would talk about the historical Jesus. I mean, you need 2 to 3 hours, because there's evidence, but it's not great, and it is what it is. But like, how much of the Old Testament is actually accurate? Like, we can toss up the Torah to being stories, the flood, Methuselah being 900 years old, all that kind of Graham Hancock wanting to prove stuff. We know that that's just not. Jonah didn't get swallowed by a fish. Right. If he did, he wouldn't have survived that. So when does the Bible start becoming historically relevant?
So I think that the first archaeological evidence that we have from non-biblical sources that actually directly attests to biblical sources comes in the 9th century. So right around the time we have the introduction of historical narrative prose, we have references to some folks from the Bible. So the 3 earliest ones that I know of are the Mesa Inscription, which is considered like the first example of narrative prose in alphabetic writing by a lot of scholars. It's probably somewhere around 840 BCE, but this is the Moabite king who writes this story on this big standing stone and says, I, Mesa, king of Moab, blah, blah, blah. He tells about all his conquests.
Where can people find info on that?
If you look for the Mesa Inscription online, you should be able to find a translation without too much trouble. But there are critical editions that have been published that will give you, diagrams, and it's not all preserved. It's actually a fascinating story. It was found as a single standing stone, but because a lot of European powers were wrestling over who got this thing, even though it was found and belonged to some Bedouin tribes, in order to kind of stick it to them.
That's what we do.
Yeah, the Bedouin tribes actually destroyed it. They put it on a fire for a long, long time, waited for it to get its stone. They put it on a fire for a long, long time, and then doused it in a bunch of cold water, and it just cracked and fell apart. And there was someone who managed to take what's called a squeeze, right before this happened, a European, and this is basically where they soak paper in water and then put it on top and press it down so the paper kind of expands into the cracks. Yeah, and then you wait for it to dry and then pull it off.
It's the pencil over the quarter.
It's something like that, yeah. And so someone actually managed to take a squeeze of it and run off with it as they were heating it up to
baller. What a baller!
Destroy it, yeah. But and so I say we Europeans managed to recover a little less than half of the pieces, but we can reconstruct most of the rest of it from the squeeze, but there are still gaps. But this refers to the Omri dynasty, Omri from the Old Testament, and it talks about how Omri's son afflicted Moab, basically put them under vassalage, and then Mesa was able to deliver them from that vassalage, and tells a story about how they invaded a cult site at Nebo, and they ran off with Adonai's instruments, cult instruments, and took them back and put them before Chemosh. And then it talks about how Israel then invaded Moab to try to punish them for throwing off vassalage, but Chemosh, the patron deity of Moab, ran them out of Moab. And some people think that this confirms the story that we have in 2 Kings 3 about Edom and Israel and Judah invading Moab because they threw off vassalage, but then ultimately failing to destroy Moab. And if that is the case, I think that lends strength to the interpretation of 2 Kings 3:27, where this great fury forces Israel to retreat, is probably the intervention of the Moabite deity Chemosh.
Wait, are you saying God lost the battle?
God lost the battle.
Oh my God. He's Jehovah Rapha. What are you talking about?
Yeah, this is where Adonai loses home court advantage.
Oh, no.
And that costs the battle.
He choked?
I think that's... if the Mesa Inscription is telling a story of the same event, I think Mesa says, hey, our god Chemosh ran him away, and whoever was responsible for writing 2 Kings 3 was kind of embarrassed by it, but was kind of like, we were almost there, and then, things fell apart and we left.
Kind of like the Fast and the Furious, dude, I almost had you. Bro, you never had your car.
Yeah, it's, when the loser tells the story, they've got to tell it in a way that doesn't make him look like quite a loser. But
he knocked me out, but man, you should have seen that. You should have seen that shot I landed.
Yeah, so that was probably the earliest reference we have to characters from the Bible. We also have what's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which comes from Assyria, which talks about the king Jehu, and actually has a drawing of Jehu bowing down before Shalmaneser III. And then we also have what's called the Tel Dan Inscription, which was probably written by an Aramaean king named Hazael, and it boasts about how he killed some Israelite and Judahite kings. And so this is our earliest reference, both to figures from the Bible as well as to the god Adonai as the patron deity of Israel. And a lot of scholars would say, so probably around the Omri dynasty, in the 9th century BCE and down, that's probably when things start to be historically correct in the broad outlines. So not necessarily every story, not Elisha and the she-bears that killed the 42 kids, but at least what kings were there, what nations were trying to do what things to other nations. Like in the broad outlines, it begins to be more historically accurate.
So Elisha didn't get UFO abducted either?
There are no chariot remains from that in the bottom of the Red Sea. But the Tel Dan inscription also mentions, according to the reading that is agreed upon by the most scholars...
I bet you like that one, don't you?
The Tel Dan inscription? Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, Tel Dan.
It's also... you can also refer to it as the that tell Dan Steely, and then you get Steely Dan, which is great too. But it references the house of David. So it doesn't talk about a kingdom, it just talks about a dynasty in Judah, the house of David. And so this could be evidence that David was a historical character as well, who began a dynasty that was still around 100 or so years later.
And if he wasn't a king, he was at least a very powerful...
Yeah, some kind of chieftain or something, yeah.
Yeah, and then they have found a couple of like symbols from Solomon, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like, or that kind of point, but there's no evidence to directly link, but they kind of hint towards.
I don't know about any material remains from Solomon.
Maybe it was a Discovery Channel thing.
It could be. We certainly have evidence of like Hezekiah and things like that. We have jar handles with stamps on them that say, you know, for the king, or that have the name Hezekiah and things like that. And there have been a handful of stamp seals and things like that with the names of biblical rulers on them.
What do they find in those jars, those old jars in Israel?
Well, normally it's actually just the handle that they've found, because they break off so easily. But every now and then they do find intact jars, and sometimes it's sometimes there are coins in there, sometimes they're empty, sometimes if they're really, really intact, which is phenomenally rare, they might find some wine or something like that. They find date pits and things like that.
Brewery stuff.
Sometimes, more so in places like Egypt, where it's a lot drier. A lot of that stuff gets preserved intact a lot better. But yeah, you find some of that stuff from time to time.
That's the stuff that I love is those little details, because like that's what actually tells the story of how like these people thought, how they lived, like these little like what was in the jar, what was you know, what colors did they use, because that speaks of a mental like state, and all those little details fascinate me.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of ways that those details are preserved. You know, we have some textiles, we have some fabric from 3,000 years ago, so we can see some of the colors that they were using in their fabrics. So you have hair that is sometimes preserved in human remains. You have little figurines and things like that, sometimes with the paint still on it. So the material remains are, I think, some of the most fascinating parts of learning about the ancient world.
And so, two kind of final questions to wrap it up. For one, why does so often the Bible get attributed to the Council of Laodicea? I think I said that right.
I think Council of Nicaea is where... Yeah.
And then... before we get off, can you teach people or give a short little how to Google competently statement? Because that is a skill that should be taught in elementary schools at this point.
Happy to. The whole idea that the biblical canon was determined at Nicaea is one of many banes of my existence. But it was mainly popularized by Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code. I think that's why most people have heard that, and it sounds reasonable to them, but it does not. Dan Brown did not originate that theory. I think the earliest reference we have to, well, first thing is that we have in the preface to the book of Esther in Jerome's Vulgate. So this was around 400 to 405 CE. Jerome is a Christian translating the scriptures into Latin. He talks about how the book of Esther was counted as scripture or inspired at the Council of Nicaea. And some people interpret this to mean that they declared it scripture at Nicaea. I think far more likely, and I think most scholars agree with me, it just means that they mentioned that it was considered scripture. So it wasn't that anything was changing, it was just that the question may have come up or someone made a statement about how it is scripture. So that's not declaring or determining the canon at all. But around the 9th century CE, so now we've moved ahead another almost 500 years, we have a text called Synodicon Vetus, which is a collection of stories about the different councils and synods that were held by the Christian church. And in that Synodicon Vetus, there is a tradition that's mentioned about how at the Council of Nicaea, they stacked all the books that were considered scripture on a table, and then miraculously, God made all the apocryphal books fall to the ground, so that the only books that were left on the table were the books of the canon. So that's,
and then it was sealed.
For the most part, yeah. That
until
was,
Luther got a hold of it.
and then we have Voltaire was a person who mentioned this tradition, and I think that maybe Dan Brown got it from Voltaire, or that in the 19th century that was kind of percolating a little bit, and so Dan Brown picked it up from some source in the 19th century or something like that. But I think most people have heard of it today because of the Da Vinci Code, and then it is taken a lot of work to try to put that theory to rest. And then as far as Googling competently goes, a lot of people have a lot of confirmation bias. They're not Googling because they want to find out what's true. They're Googling because they want to confirm their suspicions or their biases or their dogmas. And so what they'll frequently do is Google, and then as soon as they come across a hit that confirms their bias, they're done. And then that's all they needed to see, even if it's a blog post or a tweet.
So how can someone, so for instance, Appalachia, where I lived in Appalachia, my mom did not get internet in her house until like 2007. I was already off. I was gone. Like I didn't grow up. We did not have a computer in our house growing up. We didn't have internet. I still have family members who are getting their first iPhone, their first computer, their first internet. They're like turning on Facebook for the first time.
Wow.
Spending their whole life in this very, secluded area. How can they decipher what is credible, what is ancient aliens? Because they see History Channel and they know, oh, that's got to be credible. It's it's TV. It's this, it's that. What is acceptable information? As a college student, I know, and I know what to look for. And being college actually taught me how to Google competently. So, you give us a little what to look for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of keys. At minimum, if you're going to trust a source, you should probably be looking at a source that is citing other sources. If they can say, this is mentioned in this publication on this page, if they can be that detailed about their sources, that's a good sign. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of the story, but if you don't have any sources, that's not a great sign. You should not be trusting claims that are not accompanied by references or citations. Now, it takes a lot more work, but if you can actually go track down those sources and make sure that they're saying what the website said they are saying, that's a better sign. And if you can track it back to a primary text is the text as it was originally written or originally circulated. So if somebody says the Egyptian Book of the Dead says this, and they don't even say where, they don't cite a source or anything, red flags.
Right.
If they say it was from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it was from Utterance 245, and it was from this edition of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, good sign. But if you can get a hold of that book, that would be helpful to confirm things, because a lot of times they'll say that and you go look it up and it doesn't actually say what they think it said. But if you can go track down the primary texts, and a lot of people don't have the skills or the resources to be able to determine what this ancient Egyptian text is saying, or what this ancient Hebrew or Greek text is saying. But if you can track down the text and verify that the interpretation is correct, that's even better. So at a minimum, you should not be repeating claims that are being made without citing something that was published in a reputable venue. Now, one thing you can do if you want to actually find scholarship is you can use Google Scholar. So not just google.com, but scholar.google.com. And what that's going to do is look through academic publications, whether books and art or articles. You're not going to find an MSNBC article. You're not going to find something from The Blaze. You're not going to find things like that. You're going to find publications. Now, not all of the venues are reputable. Not all of the publications are accurate, but that would be a good way to narrow the results down.
Just safer
sources, right? Yes. And then, but again, you should still track down any claims. And I've made a video particularly as it relates to the origins of December 25th as the date of Christmas. You can track that down to original texts, but you have to actually go look in those original texts and see, like there's one claim that a 4th century Christian said, oh, we changed the date to this so that it would align with pagan stuff so that we could poach a bunch of pagans from paganism. And it says this is from a 4th century Christian. And you can go find a 12th century text that says this is from a 4th century Christian, but and this has been repeated in academic publications.
Yeah.
But then if you go track down that 12th century text, you discover it's actually something someone scribbled in the margins even later than that. And so it's not a 4th century text. It's something that someone scribbled in the margins of a 12th century manuscript. And so it's not always foolproof. And this is one of the reasons I try. I'm not always successful, but I try to be careful about framing things like that in terms of this is what the data as we have them indicate. We almost never talk about having proved anything because something could pop up, something could be discovered tomorrow that totally obliterates everything. And so we generally talk about what the data indicate or what the consensus view of scholars is, because even when we're using the best sources, we can still get it wrong.
Yeah, and that's what I appreciate, though, about you and other, even science in general. You approach the Bible very much like a scientist, like same way of thinking. Scientist does not care what the data says. They don't have a predetermined, I want this data to say this.
Ideally, we don't want that.
You don't. That's not a. You'll hear scientists say like we try to remove all of our biases because like the data tells the data.
Yeah,
the data tells the story, and we have nothing to add. And that's what I appreciate about that. And so, how many with our current editions of the Bible? And this will be kind of a final question. How many times has it been edited?
Oh, we can't count how many times it's been edited. We have tried to reconstruct to the degree we can kind of the path of the development of these texts, and we can talk about some kind of large-scale literary seams, but we don't know who had a hold of these texts and changed things, small things here and there along the way, how many times that happened, but just countless times.
Right. And did we know who came up with the figure of Moses?
Who came up with the figure? No, we can't say that. We think that the story probably originates in the early first millennium BCE, so 900, 800 BCE, somewhere around there. Someone in the northern hill country was sharing stories about this dude named Moses, but we can't say who it was
where
that
they
came
come
up
from.
with the story. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate it very much, and this has been fun. I'm keeping it just at an hour, like promised. But go ahead, tell everyone where to find you. I mean, there's Data Over Dogma on YouTube, but you also are on other places.
Yeah, so the Data Over Dogma podcast is our podcast, which is on YouTube. We also, the audio versions can be found wherever you get your podcasts. I go by @McClellan, and it's not spelled the way my last name is actually spelled. It's spelled McClellan. That's a phonetic spelling that I use for my last name. That's why it keeps
messing me up.
Yeah. When I was living in South America, people who aren't familiar with English frequently don't like to see names that begin with 4 consonants in a row. So I said, hey, just pronounce it like this, and they get it right off the bat. So I am @McClellan on TikTok, as long as TikTok still is around, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Threads, on Blue Sky. So I'm on a lot of different social media platforms. I also teach online courses with a couple of friends of mine, Dr. Canada Moss and Dr. Robin Faith Walsh.
Brilliant minds.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful scholars for a group that we call Didaskaloi, Didaskaloi. So the upcoming classes, I don't know when this episode will go out, but
probably today.
Okay,
so this coming tonight.
Okay, so this coming Sunday, April 28th, Dr. Walsh will be teaching a class called Early Christian Art, the Roman Catacombs, talking about some of the earliest known depictions of Jesus.
Alexios and his God.
That is, I don't know if she'll talk about that or not. But yeah, the Alexamenos Graffito. So we teach courses on there regularly. I'm actually going to I'm putting together a biblical Hebrew class. So people interested in learning Hebrew, I don't know when I'll announce it, but it'll probably start up in August, somewhere around there. Nice. Yeah, and then I am on Patreon as well. Folks who want a closer experience, I've got a Discord associated with my Patreon as well. So patreon.com/McClellan if you want to help support me, and also there are some incentives associated with that, like private, not private, but unlisted live streams that you get access to, and stuff like that. So I'm all over the place, and I'm about to finish a trade book that I hope to have published at the beginning of 2025. So if you'd like something that you can hold in your hands and refer to over the years, something like that will be coming out soon. Yeah,
I've been waiting on this. I've heard you talk about it. It's just the one I'm waiting on. I'm ready for this book, man.
Yeah, me too. I'm more excited than anybody else to see it completed.
Yeah. Oh, I am definitely getting it, and it has been a pleasure. I was nervous for the first time doing a podcast, because it's like this has been my whole world for 17 years, and I've came out of it, and I'm kind of learning how to function outside of the Bible Belt religious bubble. And it's not the easiest thing to come out of. And so I very much appreciate it, and appreciate what you do and the clarity. And I hope more people jump on the train, because data is more important than dogma, and I fear most of what we preach, most of what we say, most of the memes, and all of it is all dogma.
Yeah, mostly
the stuff I see anyway. So, all right, everyone, thank you for hanging out with us. Dan, give it just a second to finish uploading, and we will wrap up. So everybody, we'll see you next time. We have some very fun upcoming guests with the Distracted Spectrum. So stay tuned, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you, guys.